The mess hall on station Kethanara had 47 tables. I know because I counted them. I had a lot of time to count things during my first week there because nobody talked to me and I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I've been assigned to the station as part of the first permanent human military liaison detachment. 6 soldiers embedded with the KE Compact's Joint Peacekeeping Command, tasked with fostering interspecies operational cooperation, which in practice meant sitting in briefings we couldn't follow, eating food that tasted like copper and grass, and trying not to stare at the aliens we were supposedly cooperating with. I was Sergeant Marcus Vell, formerly of the 14th Expeditionary Infantry, 8 months back from a combat deployment on Thresh that I was still trying to stop dreaming about. The liaison assignment had been pitched to me as a soft landing. Get your head right, Marcus. Breathe some different air for a while. Different air. I was breathing filtered, recycled atmosphere at 0.88 standard pressure inside a spinning torus, orbiting a gas giant the color of a bruise. The KE called the planet Grandmother. I wasn't sure if that was a translation artifact or if they actually thought the enormous, swirling violet mass below us was some kind of ancestor figure. I'd stopped asking questions like that after the second week when I noticed that every question I asked made the assigned K cultural liaison, a creature called Adept Vorin, give a small sigh that seemed to indicate I was the least promising student he'd ever had the misfortune of teaching. 47 tables. I'd eaten at most of them, working my way around the room by rotation because that was easier than deciding and because it meant I was always moving. And moving felt like something close to purpose. The mess hall was shared by 3 species. The Keth themselves, gray-skinned and tall and formal in everything they did. The Vorath, who were amphibious and traveled in tight clusters and apparently found it physically distressing to eat alone. And the Sarathi, who were, well, the Sarathi were complicated. There were 12 Sarathi on station Kethanara, which was already unusual. The Keth and the Sarathi had been at war twice in the last century, with a cold peace holding between them, now only because both species were too exhausted and too economically entangled to resume hostilities. The 12 Sarathi on the station were there as part of the same peacekeeping framework that had brought me here. A show of cooperative intent, a gesture of good faith from the Sarathi hegemony to the Keth compact. They were observers. They were watched constantly. They moved through the station in the way smoke moves through a room. Always present, never quite settling. I noticed that the Sarathi didn't sit together. That wasn't the kind of thing you'd necessarily catch in a briefing. The cultural files said the Sarathi were highly individualistic compared to Keth social norms, which I'd taken to mean they just preferred their own company. But after 3 weeks of eating my way around the mess hall, I'd started to see a different pattern. The 11 Sarathi, who weren't her, always sat at the same cluster of tables near the curved viewport, always arranged in a loose configuration that allowed line of sight to each other. They moved together when they moved. They acknowledged each other with small, precise gestures when they passed. She didn't sit with them. She sat alone at table 31, which was set against the interior wall of the mess hall, away from the viewport, away from the lights that brightened near the food stations. She was there every morning when I came in, and she was usually still there when I left. She had a tray in front of her that sometimes had food on it and sometimes didn't. She had a data pad she read from, or appeared to read from. I'd caught her not moving her eyes sometimes, just sitting there with the pad in her hands like she'd forgotten it was there. She was blue. The rest of the Sarathi on the station ranged from a muted gray-violet to a deep charcoal, colors that the Keth's subdued lighting complemented without drawing attention. She was the blue of deep water, the blue of the sky on Thresh at about 4 o'clock in the morning, when the light was just starting to touch the eastern hills, and you weren't sure if you were looking at night or at something else. Her brow ridges were more pronounced than the other Sarathis, and her eyes were a paler color, almost white at the iris with a dark center. She wore the Sarathi observer's sash across her shoulder, but hers had an additional marking on it, a symbol I didn't recognize, rendered in thread that caught the light differently from the rest of the fabric. I asked Adept Vorin about the symbol in the 4th week. Vorin was quiet for a moment, which with him meant he was deciding how much to tell me versus how much to deflect. The symbol indicates hereditary standing within the Sarathi hegemony, he said eventually. So she's important? She is categorically significant. That was as much as I got. I had learned to hear Varan's silences as a kind of secondary language. That particular silence said, "This is a matter I prefer not to elaborate on in the presence of a human who will ask follow-up questions." I started to form my own theory. On Thresh, I had known a soldier named Pina, who had the rare distinction of being both the best shot in the regiment and the most profoundly unlucky person I had ever met. Not unlucky in the small ways, not the kind of luck that meant dropped coffee or missed transport, but unlucky in the deep structural sense, where every situation somehow arranged itself to make his life harder than it needed to be. Pena had once told me that the worst thing about his particular kind of bad luck wasn't the difficulty itself, but the way people treated the difficulty. Everyone thinks bad luck is contagious. Nobody wants to sit next to the guy who keeps getting hit. Nobody wanted to sit next to her. I watched it happen in a dozen small ways over the next 2 weeks. Sarathi from the other 11 would walk past her table on the way to theirs and not break stride. Keth officers who'd stop and exchange social acknowledgments with other Sarathi, those small formal head movements their culture used as greetings, would avoid eye contact as they passed her. The Vorath, who were generally oblivious to everything outside their own clusters, had nonetheless arranged their habitual table positions to be maximally distant from table 31. She sat there reading her datapad and didn't look up at any of them. There's a particular kind of stillness that people develop when they're used to being treated like they don't exist. I'd seen it in patients at the mental health processing center they sent me to after Thresh. I'd seen it in old soldiers who'd been waiting for decisions that never came. It wasn't peace. It wasn't acceptance. It was the particular, exhausted discipline of someone who had learned that reacting cost more than staying still. She had that stillness. I told myself it wasn't my business for about 2 more days. Then on a Tuesday, the Keth stations ran on a 7-unit cycle they called a week, and I'd mapped it to Tuesday in my head because I needed something to call it. I picked up my tray, walked across the mess hall, pulled out the chair across from her at table 31, and sat down. She looked up from the datapad. Her white irised eyes settled on me with a look of such careful neutrality that I could see the effort behind it, like watching someone walk on ice and pretending they weren't. "Sergeant Marcus Vell," I said. "Human Liaison Detachment. We haven't met officially." She was quiet for a moment. "We have not," she said. Her translator rendered her voice into a low, even tone I suspected was calmer than the original. "I am Sarathi." I know your species. I don't know your name." Another pause. "Vartho," she said in what I recognized as the Sarathi naming convention. "House, function, given." The function designation has no adequate translation. "Can I call you Cien?" "You may call me whatever you find convenient." It came out neutral, but the neutrality had a texture to it. She was waiting for me to leave. She'd had a lot of practice waiting for people to leave. "I'm going to eat my breakfast," I said. "I've been eating it at a different table every morning because I don't know anybody well enough to eat with them twice in a row, and I figured this morning I'd try table 31. She looked at the table, then at me, then back at the datapad. "Very well," she said. I ate. She didn't ask me anything. I didn't ask her anything. After about 10 minutes, she spoke without looking up. "You have been on the station for 31 days. "Yeah." "You have not returned to any table more than once." So she'd noticed me moving around. "I've been getting the lay of the land," I said. "The mess hall's layout has not changed since you arrived." "No," I agreed. "It hasn't." She looked up again. Something moved behind those pale eyes. Some tiny recalibration? "What is it that you actually want, Sergeant Vell?" "Right now, I want to finish this thing they've told me is a protein preparation, which I'm going to continue to believe is vat-grown, even though I have real doubts." I pushed the substance on my tray in her direction. "Do you know what this is?" For a moment, she just looked at it. Then she said, "It is called Keth Morning Aggregate. It is nutritionally appropriate for carbon-based metabolisms of several species. It tastes like mineral compound because it is partially mineral compound." She paused. "Most beings find it unpleasant." I reached for the fluid preparation on my tray. "Thanks." She returned to her datapad. I ate my breakfast. I came back the next morning and she was there, and I sat down again. Neither of us said anything for a while, and that was fine. On the third morning, she asked me what Thresh was like, because she had been reviewing deployment records and my service file indicated recent combat operations in that system. I told her about Thresh. Not the bad parts, not yet, but the parts I could say out loud without losing something. The color of the light at 4 in the morning. The way the wind came down from the northern ranges and carried a smell like pine. And something else. Something you couldn't name that got into your lungs and made you feel briefly, overwhelmingly, that you were somewhere worth being, even when you weren't sure that was true. The way Pina could hit a target at 800 meters with the same casual ease with which he'd also somehow managed to drop his rations in the mud. The soldiers I'd served with who were still there, and the ones who weren't. She listened. She was a very good listener, still in the way I was beginning to understand was specific to her. The kind of still that meant she was fully present inside it, not absent. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The function designation in my name refers to my role within the hegemony. It means, approximately, diplomatic weight. I was sent here because I am useful when the hegemony needs to make a gesture." "What kind of gesture?" "The kind that costs nothing to make," she said. "Sending someone whose presence signals goodwill without requiring the hegemony to commit anything of actual value. I am," she paused, searching for phrasing, "a currency that is valuable in appearance but does not reduce the treasury by being spent." I sat with that for a moment. "They sent you because you don't matter," I said, because I'd learned that she didn't want things softened. That softening was a form of condescension she'd been subjected to enough. "They sent me because I matter in the right ways, and not in the ways that would be costly to risk." She closed the data pad. "The blue coloring is a hereditary marker from the old Kale line. It has not appeared in the hegemony's dominant families for 200 years. When I was born, it was considered an omen. There is a school of Sarathi thinking that holds that such throwbacks represent a disruption of the species' trajectory, a genetic echo of something the hegemony spent considerable effort moving away from." "What does the other school think?" "The other school is considerably smaller." A pause. "The marking on my sash indicates hereditary standing from the Kale bloodline, which is ancient. But ancient in the hegemony's current political architecture is not the same as powerful." A small exhale that might have been the Sarathi version of a laugh. "The blood is old. The influence is not. So you're—" "I am notable enough to be useful and different enough to be uncomfortable. It is a very specific kind of position." She picked up her data pad and set it down again. "I have occupied it for most of my life. I went back every morning. By the end of the first month of eating at table 31, I had learned things about Sion that I was fairly confident nobody else on the station knew, because she didn't tell things to people who weren't there, and she hadn't had many people there. I learned that she had been educated in the hegemony's diplomatic track from age 7, that she spoke 4 compact languages and 3 dialects, that she had been posted to 6 prior stations and 3 planetary assignments, and none of them had lasted more than 8 months before she was reassigned, always with official commendations she suspected were written mostly to explain why she was being moved on. I learned that she found the Keth architectural aesthetic genuinely beautiful, and found most Keth individuals impossible to read, and found Adept Voran specifically to be the kind of bureaucratic caution engine she'd been managed by her entire career. I learned that she had a particular interest in the pre-war histories of the Keth-Sarathi relationship. Not the wars, but the long stretches of contact before them, when the two species had simply been curious about each other, and the curiosity hadn't yet curdled into fear and then violence. I told her about Pina. Eventually, I told her the full story of Pina, which took 3 mornings because I kept stopping and having to restart. "He sounds like someone who was never allowed to exist in the space between his misfortune and his competence," she said when I'd finished. "Yeah," I said. "That's exactly it." She looked at me with those pale eyes. "Most people are not able to formulate that observation about a friend. He would have hated me for being sentimental about it." "Probably," she agreed, "but you would have told him anyway." "Yeah." She nodded. just a small nod. The kind that meant I have understood something about you that I did not understand before. I'd started to learn her vocabulary of small, precise gestures over the weeks. Not Sarathi formal gestures, which I was studying separately with Voren and making glacial progress on, but the ones that were specifically hers, the personal grammar she developed over a life of finding that the approved grammar didn't quite fit. The trouble started in the 7th week. A Keth official arrived on station, a senior attaché from the Compact's Political Oversight Division, a creature named Magistrate Orvin, who moved through the station with the specific slow deliberateness of someone accustomed to the station rearranging itself around their passage. Orvin had an entourage of 4 subordinates and a cultural protocols officer who was visibly stressed at all times. Orvin was on station to review the progress of the Joint Peacekeeping Command integration, which in practice meant Orvin was on station to remind everyone who held the authority in this particular arrangement. I noticed Orvin notice her. On the 2nd day, it happened in the mess hall. She was at table 31. I was at the food station getting the fluid preparation because I had taken her advice and it was, in fact, marginally less terrible. I was watching the room because watching rooms was something I did automatically now. Even 7 months after Thresh, even on a space station orbiting a gas giant with no active hostilities within 6 light years, I watched rooms. I saw Orvin's entourage enter. I saw Orvin's gaze travel the room and land on her. I saw the quality of that gaze. I'd seen that quality of gaze before. It was the gaze of someone who has found a useful object. Orvin crossed the mess hall and stopped at table 31. The protocols officer materialized at Orvin's elbow, visibly more stressed than usual. Cien looked up from her data pad. I couldn't hear the exchange from where I was standing, but I watched it happen across the 40 feet between us. Watched the angles of it, the way Orvin stood and the way she sat, and the way her stillness intensified into something that was no longer just discipline, but was now also defense. I watched Orvin's head tilt twice. A Keth gesture I'd learned meant the issuing of an informal directive. I watched her respond. I watched Orvin's entourage close slightly around the table, not enough to be a physical threat, but enough to be a pressure. I walked across the mess hall and sat down at table 31. Orvan's attention moved to me with a particular quality of attention given to an obstruction that has appeared unexpectedly. The protocol's officer's visible stress increased by several measurable degrees. "Good morning," I said to Orvin, in the Keth formal greeting I'd spent 4 weeks learning to pronounce correctly. I turned to Cien. "Sorry I'm late. You said you wanted to go over the integration briefing materials this morning. I've got the files here." She looked at me. I had never mentioned any integration briefing materials to her. She had no idea what I was doing. But she was, as I had said, a diplomat trained from age 7. She looked at me for exactly the correct amount of time, and then she turned to Orvin and said something in the formal Keth register that I recognized as a closing of a conversation. Orvin looked at me for a long moment. "Liaison Sergeant," the protocols officer said in translated standard. "The magistrate was engaged in a conversation relevant to the integration review. I apologize for the interruption. If the magistrate needs time with Observer Varth Kale, we can reschedule," I said. "I just know she has a full schedule this morning." I looked at Cien. "Isn't that right?" "My schedule is quite full," she confirmed, in a tone so flawlessly calibrated I felt briefly overwhelmed by the sheer technical skill of it. Orvin looked between us. Then the magistrate said something in Keth that the translator rendered as a standard farewell, and moved away, entourage trailing. The protocols officer gave me a look that contained approximately 17 distinct messages, none of them warm, and followed. I sat down properly, set my tray on the table, and picked up the fluid preparation. Cien was quiet for a moment. "What did you just do?" "I sat down for breakfast." "You interrupted a compact magistrate." "I joined a colleague for a scheduled meeting." "There is no scheduled meeting." "There is now. We're meeting about the integration briefing materials." "I have no integration briefing materials." "Then we'll need to create some."